Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us. My name is Andrea Baldwin, and I am a junior consultant at ILGA World. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you today to this webinar on the pandemic and post-pandemic advancements of LGBTI human rights. This event is organized by ILGA World. ILGA World is a worldwide federation of more than 1,700 organizations from over 160 countries campaigning for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and intersex human rights. ILGA World carries out projects in various UN forums and provides technical support to organizations working with treaty bodies to ensure that LGBTI people are taken into account under international human rights law. Thank you very much for joining us. Today we have some brilliant panelists who will share their experiences with UN treaty bodies through shadow reporting and individual communications, and one that will be presenting ILGA World's findings of the annual treaty bodies report for 2022. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this event. Please use the Q&A box on the chat to ask any questions that you might have for our panelists. At the end, we will be able to answer those questions. We will begin the discussion with Facundo Sesin. Facundo is a lawyer, international human rights law and international humanitarian law lecturer and researcher at the University of Buenos Aires. Facundo served as foreign policy and human rights advisor for the Ministry of Women, Genders and Diversity in Argentina. Facundo also served as a research consultant for ILGA World. He is the author of the 2022 Annual Treaty Bodies Report for ILGA World. Facundo, welcome and thank you for working with ILGA on this report. Facundo will be sharing the findings of the report. Welcome, Facundo.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Hello, everyone, wherever you're listening to us. It is a pleasure for me to be here presenting the annual Treaty Bodies report of ILGA World. I will share screen for a moment to share a brief presentation on the annual treaty bodies. Just let me know if you can see and hear me well. Yes? Perfect. Okay, so the annual treaty bodies report is a document that has been developed by ILGA since 2014, and that the report serves as a compilation and an analysis, both qualitative and quantitative, of references and recommendations on sexual orientation, gender identity and gender expression, sex characteristics of the 9 treaty bodies of the United Nations. It is a compilation because you will find in those reports the specific information of the documents of the United Nations that include these SOGIESC references, the direct reference, you will find it, but it is also an analysis because with ILGA, we have made an analysis of the number of references and the main topics that are involved, and with different criteria that I will now go over. So what does the report analyze and compiles, of course? From state party reviews, it compiles and analyzes the list of issues and list of issues prior to reporting that include any SOGIESC reference. It also includes SOGIESC references and recommendations made in concluding observations, and of course, any SOGIESC reference on the follow-up procedures. The report also includes general comments and general recommendations, as well as individual communications and CSO shadow reports. CSO shadow reports are also compiled and analyzed, of course, the specific SOGIESC references of those reports. The purpose of this report, of the annual treaty bodies report, is to facilitate advocates, lawyers, and human rights defenders the identification of SOGIESC questions and recommendations made to each of the states under review, the identification of the position and trends of each committee on SOGIESC issues, and by identifying both the questions and recommendations made to the state, as well as the position and trends of each committee, we intend to facilitate the design and implementation of advocacy strategies for future decisions of the committees. That's the main purpose of the report at the end of the day, to ensure that activists and lawyers can use this report as a tool to design their strategies for future concluding observations, general recommendations, on any other intervention by the treaty bodies of the United Nations. Now, The report follows a certain structure that you will see in each of the chapters of the report. The different parts of the report include one general chapter, 9 specific chapters, 1 per committee. The first annex with the list of countries reviewed in 2022. A second annex with the compilation of CSO shadow reports and the specific references, not all the reports, of course. And annex 3 with the number and percentage of references made since 2014 till 2022, of course, SOGIESC references. But inside each chapter, you will find that it is divided in the following sections: general information regarding specifically quantitative, the themes that were the themes that each treaty body related to SOGIESC issues, the references to criminalization if they were made, of course, and another for gender identity and gender expression, another for sex characteristics, another for women, another for individual communications, another for general comments and general recommendations, and another for follow-up procedures. So you will see that there are different parts with different type of information, and that is all structured in a similar way in order to go and find the information per committee in a same methodology and trying to make it easier for the person that is reading that report. So 2022 was a great year, fortunately. After 2 years of reduced activity by the 9 treaty bodies, 2022 saw a significant increase in terms of the amount of SOGIESC references that were made in 2022. In fact, the committees returned to their level of activity before COVID-19, just the same as 2019 or any other year before. And in 2022, 218 SOGIESC references were made on 73 different states. This is an absolute record. Never before such amount of SOGIESC references were made. And it is a significant increase. That is something that, of course, we should recognize as something positive, despite the fact that there are certain challenges that we will now go over. 67% of concluding observations included SOGIESC references or recommendations. More than half of the states basically received SOGIESC recommendations that were reviewed in 2022. 59 states, and this is really important also, received SOGIESC recommendations for the first time since they were first reviewed. And 6 out of 9 committees made more SOGIESC references than in previous years. Regarding gender identity and sex characteristics, 24 specific references to gender identity and expression were made, and 25 specific reference to sex characteristics. In these specific categories related to gender identity and expression and sex characteristics, there was not a significant increase. There was a low increase, perhaps, but not something as big as the increase that happened with the overall number of SOGIESC references. Now we will go over each committee to understand which were the main findings, which were the positive findings, the main topics, and the challenges. You will see that, again, each committee is structured in the same way to facilitate the understanding of the information. So starting with the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The positive findings on the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is that 100% of states received SOGIESC recommendations, and this is really important. All the states in the reviewed received in one way or another a SOGIESC recommendation, and it's an absolute record. 20 references were made relating to SOGIESC. And a really important fact is that 11 out of 12 states that received SOGIESC recommendations also received CSO reports mentioning SOGIESC issues. And this is really significant to see how the participation of CSO can actually influence the work and the recommendations of the different committees. The main topics that were addressed by this committee were discrimination, both legislation and policy, awareness raising campaigns, health, housing, and work, and discrimination in education, including bullying. And the challenges that this committee has is that out of the 20 references, only 2 were intersex specific. no references at all were made to LGBTI women, and only 3 were trans-specific references. So this shows us that even if there is a commitment by the committee to advance on certain issues, it is important to continue advocating for intersex and trans-specific issues and show how these communities are significantly affected in the enjoyment of their economic, social, and cultural rights. Moving on with the Human Rights Committee, the positive findings in this committee is that 35 SOGIESC references were made, which is also a record. 8 trans-specific references were also made, and 16 out of 17 states that received SOGIESC recommendations also received CSO reports mentioning SOGIESC. The main topics for this committee were anti-discrimination legislation, awareness-raising campaigns, violence, including hate speech and hate crimes, and the violation of the civil and political rights of human rights defenders. The challenges that this committee has perhaps is that only 1 references was made to LGBTI women, and only 3 were made for intersex specific references. I didn't mention this, but when we talk about intersex specific or trans specific, we are referring to references or recommendations that are, as its name says, related directly to these groups, and that are not included in an overall way, just as mentioning LGBTI. That's not specific. We are mentioning those references or recommendations that are related to the specific challenges that these communities are facing. Moving on to the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the positive finding is that 88% of states received SOGIESC recommendations, which is a really significant number. And the committee, the CEDAW, as previous years, made the most SOGIESC references of all committees with 72 numbers. That is really a record. And the main topics with having 72 references are quite more varied perhaps than other committees. Of course, many references and the most were to intersectional discrimination, to temporary special measures, to gender-based violence against LGBTI women and intersex persons, including sexual violence, health, work, education, and housing, legislation, policies, and access to justice, and arbitrary detention of LGBTI women. But which are the challenges that the CEDAW faces in terms of what can be improved? Criminalization references, only 2 out of 7 states that criminalize sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, or sex characteristics, only 2 receive recommendations or references in that regard. So we have 5 states that criminalized SOGIESC and still didn't receive from the CEDAW any recommendation in that regard. Then we have 5 intersex specific references that they are higher than other committees, of course, but with 72 references, it's a low number in terms of the work of the CEDAW. Then we have 6 trans-specific references, the same, and references to lesbian or bisexual women, only 1 was made. And we're talking about the CEDAW. So we know that specifically on trans issues and on lesbian and bisexual women, more can be done by the CEDAW, and it is important that advocates show how the specific issues that each community face in order for the committee to make those specific recommendations. Then moving on to the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the positive findings is that 44 SOGIESC references were made, a record again. 9 intersex specific references were made, which is really a huge number compared with other committees. And 15 out of 16 states that received SOGIESC recommendations also received CSO reports. The main topics were discrimination, hate speech, awareness-raising campaigns, and non-consented medical intervention on intersex children. The challenges that this committee perhaps is facing is that only 1 out of 6 states that criminalized SOGIESC received a specific reference in that regard. So again, we have 5 states that criminalized SOGIESC that didn't receive any recommendation related to their criminalization and the impact that criminalization may have on, of course, children under 18 or any person under 18, including teenagers. No references were made to LGBTI women, and only 3 trans-specific references were made. So there is room for perhaps more references from the Committee on the Rights of the Child in this regard. On the Committee Against Torture, the amount of SOGIESC references remained similar to previous years, but 100% of SOGIESC references were trans-inclusive. We consider that it's positive that there was no any regressive situation. That's why we consider that it is positive that at least after the pandemic, they stayed with the same number. The main topics were, of course, based on the function of the Committee Against Torture, violence, including harassment and threats, hate crimes, deprivation of liberty, and access to justice. But again, as a challenge, we have that 2 out of 7 states that criminalize SOGIESC, and that criminalization has a real impact and a huge impact related to how SOGIESC communities suffer degrading treatment or any other sort of violence, perhaps even amounting to torture. So only 2 states out of 7 received criminalization references, and 5, of course, did not. Intersex-specific references, only 1, and considering the impact it has in terms of the mutilation for forced medical interventions, perhaps this is something that the Committee Against Torture could make more references about. And trans-specific references, again, only 3. On the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, 71% of states received SOGIESC recommendations. That is a record, of course, and 20 SOGIESC references were made by the CRPD, again, a record. The main topics were data collection, participation, intersectional discrimination, and anti-discrimination legislation and policies. The challenges, again, is that 0 references were made to criminalization, 1 to trans-specific references, and 0 to LGBTI women. And we are talking that they had made 20 SOGIESC references. So when compared with the number of references that no references were made to no trans-specific references, no reference to criminalization or LGBTI women, perhaps is a challenge that the CRPD is facing, and that advocates are encouraged to present shadow reports showing how this affects people with disabilities, LGBTI people with disabilities. On the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the positive finding is that it has made 8 SOGIESC references. It is a positive finding because it is a record for the third. 3 references to trans women were made out of 8, so it's something really positive. And almost all states that received SOGIESC recommendations also received shadow reports. The main topics were data collection, participation, intersectional discrimination, and anti-discrimination legislation and policies. But again, it faced some challenges: no reference to criminalization, no intersex-specific references, and no SOGIESC references or no SOGIESC recommendations were chosen for the follow-up procedure. On the Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the positive finding is that 100% of states received SOGIESC references, both in concluding observations and questions in the list of issues or list of issues prior to reporting. And this is something really remarkable, because never before it happened. And to have 100% of those SOGIESC questions and recommendations is something really positive. 9 SOGIESC references were made and 100 were trans-inclusive. The main topics were data collection and compensation and reparations to victims of victims or the families of enforced disappearance, and challenges: no references to LGBTI, no trans-specific references, and no intersex references. On the Committee on the Protection of the Right of all migrant workers and members of their families, the committee made no SOGIESC references in concluding observations. This is not something regressive, because over the years, it was not a committee that actually made these sort of recommendations. And 3 states received SOGIESC questions in their list of issues prior to reporting, specifically on anti-discrimination legislation. Regarding individual communications, 8 documents on cases mentioned sexual orientation or gender identity. 3 decisions on SOGIESC cases. 2 were made by the Human Rights Committee, specifically on freedom of peaceful assembly. In general, they were against the Russian Federation, and they involved questions of the violation to freedom of peaceful assembly by victims that intended to make a sort of pride marches or any other kind of march, and they were denied to do so. And there is a really important case from the CEDAW against Sri Lanka that deepens how criminalization affects the enjoyment of the human rights And it's a quite important case that came out in 2022. And then there was a follow-up of the case of AB versus Finland. Sorry, it says Finlandia because of the Spanish event with Finland, where two lesbian women were deported to a state, and they were alleged that the best interest of the child should have led them stay in Finland. And well, there is a follow-up of the reparations of that case. And regarding general comments and recommendations, the only two were issued in 2022, one from the CEDAW on indigenous